18 episodes into the second season of the hit TV show Glee, Rachel, a Jewish character on the show, played by the actress Lea Michele, contemplates getting a nose job. Any of you remember this episode? Yeah, a couple of you, right? Maybe some of you remember this TV show from way back in the early 2010s when many people in this room were being born. Anyway, this is a show about a high school dance choir group, a glee club, basically. And Rachel suffers an injury to her nose during a rehearsal. And the doctor gives her the opportunity to have not just to fix the problem, but to actually have reconstructive surgery, i.e. a nose job. And he thinks it's a great idea. The doctor thinks it's a good idea. Her friend, who has a cute little button nose, thinks it's a good idea. And the rest of the episode becomes an exploration of how teenagers deal with having differences from some ideal of beauty or perfection that they know the world holds that is different on them. And it's not just this one character. We get to see the inner lives and struggles of many characters on the show. Some kids are embarrassed about some physical feature of their body, like their weight or their eye color. Some are embarrassed about the need to wear glasses or be in a wheelchair. Some have a mental illness they're struggling with. At the beginning of the episode, we learn that a couple popular characters are afraid to share that they are gay. Everyone is struggling with whether or not and how to let people know the truth about them. And so this week's Torah portion, Emor, includes a few lines that have deeply challenged Torah readers for millennia, having to do with exactly this issue. Basically, whether and how much of what makes one different should the community see? And how does that make us feel about ourselves? And so this conversation emerges through some pretty challenging verses. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God says to Moses, speak to Aaron and tell him, for the generations to come, none of your descendants who have a defect may come near to offer sacrifices to his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame or disfigured or deformed. No man with a crippled foot or hand who is a hunchback or dwarf or who has an eye defect or any festering wound or running sores or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron the priest who has any defect is to come near to present the food offerings to God. He must not go near the curtain or approach the altar and so desecrate my sanctuary. I am the Lord who makes them holy. Oof, right? I think this was your son's Torah portion last year. Yeah, right. This is a tough one. I can understand why Olivia was attracted to other pieces of the Torah reading. It is so hard to read this every year because the Torah seems to be saying that the Kohen, priest, is only allowed to do the specific stuff in the temple service on behalf of the community in public if they are physically perfect. And not just physically perfect, right, without like festering wounds or a crippled foot or a lazy eye, but also functionally perfect, not blind, not walking with a limp. The prohibition that includes even damaged testicles seems to imply that even hidden illnesses or defects also disqualify a person. This sucks. Right? This is one of many places in the Torah we just kind of wish wasn't there, where the words on the page directly contradict a value that we hold dear today, right? And seems to actually confirm the cruel feeling that so many of us live with, described in that episode, that if we show our differences to the world, we won't be accepted. Right? Could the Torah really be saying that human beings with physical or mental differences aren't as fit to serve as people who are, quote, perfect? And if that's what it's saying, and you disagree, and I imagine you do, I find myself disagreeing with this profoundly, then what do we do with this book, right? So full of ancient and in some cases deeply problematic verses that categorically exclude people we don't actually think should be excluded from mainstream public life. That we have moved forward and changed our ethos a great deal since this book was written, between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, that we are still reading and trying to make sense of today. So Rabbi Lauren Tuckman is a beautiful thinker and teacher who happens to be blind. And she writes on this week's Torah portion, well, You could ignore this passage, given that Kohanim are no longer enjoy the privileged status they once had in the aftermath of the temple's destruction. We might be horrified by this passage, but we might also remember that we might also comfort ourselves with the knowledge that no longer are individuals with disabilities explicitly forbidden from ritual and communal leadership, as evidenced by the tiny but steadily growing cohort of rabbis, rabbinical students, cantors, and others who are bravely and boldly exercising spiritual leadership that is so desperately needed. We might think to ourselves, we're working ceaselessly for change. And in the aftermath of the passage of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, life has improved for individuals with disabilities immeasurably in our society. We could remember back in the day, the practice was actually often to euthanize babies that had physical defects. So given that as an alternative, what our text describes, just not letting them serve as priests, actually seems pretty progressive by contrast, right? So Tuckman writes, we can look at this passage as merely a relic of its day and congratulate ourselves for moving past it. And then she says, but can we really? And of course, the answer is no. We can't congratulate ourselves for moving past this kind of thinking because its presence in the Torah and the fact that we're bothered by it alerts us to a persistent human dynamic that we are very much still wrestling with, right? A basic human bias that we all hold in one way or another against difference, which shows up in our immediate visceral reactions to physical appearance, our own and others. Just think of what happens when you look in the mirror and you have a pimple that wasn't there yesterday, like a physical imperfection, how it makes you feel. And certainly how we encounter differences in ability and physicality also in ourselves and others around us. And this line to the Torah and our reaction to it is like this big red warning sign asking us to pay closer attention, that there's something we need to examine here, some kind of healing, some kind of tikkun that we collectively need to make. And so one thing I always warn our B'nai Mitzvah students when reading Torah is to be careful, because the Torah looks like a document full of instructions, things to do, prescriptions. But it's actually a document describing how humans actually are, descriptions. The Torah does, of course, contain timeless wisdom for us that has not changed in millennia. But it also contains timeless truths about human failings and shortcomings and biases, which if we pay attention to those too, we can learn what to do by not repeating them. And I think this is one of those places we can't read the Torah prescriptively, of course, even though the priesthood doesn't exist anymore and we don't even have the opportunity to be following this literally, but we can't read it prescriptively anyway. We have to read it descriptively. And so in understanding what biases the Torah is alerting us to, we can try to transcend them, or at least do our absolute hardest to work harder at welcoming and affirming and loving the things that make us and people around us different from whatever idealized, perfect, whole, false standard we're all holding ourselves to. And to be clear, we're not doing any favors for people with disabilities or visible differences. Rather, we're making the world safer and healthier and happier for everyone, liberating all of us from false standards of beauty and body and brains that confine us. And we're all confined and hurt by false ideals of beauty and bodies and health. In Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, have any of you read this? Okay, highly recommend, especially for people raising children, but like really for all of us. He correlates the dramatic decline in teenage mental health, especially among girls, not just with smartphones and social media, but with the invention of the front-facing camera, which along with that, turned selfies into a thing, making us all obsessed with how our image compares with the filtered, adjusted, AI-infused, perfect faces and bodies we're seeing on our feeds. And we're seeing regularly because we have our feeds with us in our pocket at all times. And so we are just constantly in a state of comparison mode. This is harming all of us. And of course, this kind of social comparison to an ideal has been present for millennia as a feature of human society, as evidenced by our Torah reading today, but it's now on steroids for all of us all the time. Rabbi Ruth Adar writes, I got the idea from this Torah portion that a person leading services should be physically perfect, and that if I needed a cane or a wheelchair to function, then I was not fit to lead a service. For years, I hid my own disability when it came time to lead services, despite the fact that standing for any length of time gave me excruciating pain. She writes, as a result, I was not my best on the bima. I was fuzzy-minded and clouded with pain. I mispronounced words. I forgot things. I didn't give my congregation the leadership it deserved. Eventually, I decided I shouldn't even be a congregational rabbi because of the disability I struggled to hide. How sad is this? Think of all of the talented people with disabilities who have had to exert great effort to hide them, or exert great effort because the architecture of the world doesn't lend itself to a wheelchair or a walker or hearing or vision disabilities. And so oftentimes the effort that it takes for someone to share their talent or brilliance ends up coming in spite of overcoming that disability, instead of just in the presence of it, right? Or through the wisdom and beauty arrived at having lived with it and having it just be a seamless part of the whole person. Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer, who is a professor in theology and religious studies at Georgetown, recently won the National Jewish Book Award, which is a big deal, with a book she recently wrote called Loving Your Own Bones, Disability Wisdom and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. She says, rather than asking, what do religious texts have to say about disability? She says, what does disability have to offer the Jewish tradition, to spiritual life, and to the practice of building meaningful community? Because the truth is, differences and disabilities are all over the Torah. And now I'm sort of expanding to include differences that distinguish a person from some idealized norm, which in their day was some version of an able-bodied cis hetero man, though probably not white, because we're talking about the ancient Middle East. Our patriarch Isaac was blind, right? Our patriarch Jacob walked with a limp after a wrestling accident. Our patriarch Joseph, by all accounts, was a flamboyant, multicolored coat-wearing fashionista who had no interest in the sexual advances of his female sexy employer. Maybe into guys? And then you have Moses, who expresses his self-doubt because he can't speak clearly, because he has a stutter. And so Watts-Belzer points out that Moses' brother Aaron stands in as the first reasonable accommodation in the Torah, becoming an essential part of the prophet's communication team. God grants Moses the gift of signs, his staff, the plagues, an invitation to embrace visual language and tactile experiences rather than only relying on language, on words. God also promises to be with Moses as he speaks. And God doesn't fix Moses' tongue, but actually relies on it and gives him support, because God created Moses in the first place. God created Moses' tongue. God will be with him and open his heart to believe that he actually has everything he needs to lead. The truth is, even the rabbis who created modern Judaism 2,000 years ago, in the way that Olivia described, on the heels of the destruction of everything that we knew and the need to recreate a religion without a priesthood and without a temple. So they understood that the problem here is not with the person who has the difference, whatever the difference is. The problem is our bias. The issue is how we get distracted by other people's differences. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says that the Kohen with stains on his hands may not give the priestly blessing, right? That thing that Ari just did a few minutes ago, right? When the priest would put up their hands and give the priestly blessing. So a priest with stains on his hands is not allowed to do it. Why? It says because the people might be inclined to stare. Rabbi Adar writes, if in fact the reason for keeping Kohanim with visible defects from the temple was that people will stare, then it suggests the problem is not the disability, but in people's reactions to the differences, to the disabilities, even differences as innocuous as stains on your hands. A few hundred years later, the rabbis in the Talmud go even further in correcting and counteracting the harmful implications of the Torah text, writing in the Talmud, if the Kohen is known locally and people are used to him, then there is no impediment in him leading and participating in the service. Meaning, if people know him, know his mind and his skills, it's fine for him to serve, despite what might disqualify him in another place because people would judge him negatively for his flaws because they just didn't know him. Once we know someone, we accept them and love them not despite their differences, but in the presence of them. It's just part of who they are. We accept them the way that God accepts Moses, broken yet whole, worthy of being seen as a leader, not by fixing the differences or disabilities or hiding them, but by recognizing them and accommodating them so that a person's wisdom and talent can flow freely. So paradoxically, where we started in the Torah, plus the couple of thousands of years of development, help us see where the real change lies and healing lies. And it's not the person with the difference. It's all of us who are so easily distracted. The problem is a world that perpetuates harmful and unrealistic ideals of perfection and then asks us all to be more like that ideal and less like our beautiful, varied selves. Rabbi Adar writes, if I'm distracted by someone's race or their accent or the wheelchair they use, the fault isn't in them. Rather, my task is to get over it, or more accurately, to get over myself. Now, the bias against and suspicion of difference is something that evolved in our brains probably millions of years ago, probably for self-protection out on the savannah when any little change could have portended danger. And so overcoming or transcending this instinct isn't something you think about and learn once. It's something that we have to practice again and again and lovingly help each other remember. Part of being in community is being safe enough to share our true selves. And by doing that, helping and inspiring other people around us to feel that they also can share their true selves and be accepted and loved. The way this episode of Glee ends is with a big dance number at the end, with every Glee Club member coming out on stage in a t-shirt that announces the very thing that we, as the audience, knew they were self-conscious about, but they were trying to hide. And the dance number begins with the first teenage boy on stage whose t-shirt says, likes boys. And next to him is a black female student whose t-shirt says, no weave. And on the stage next to them dances an adorable guy in a cute little hat whose t-shirt says, can't sing. And next to him is a kid whose t-shirt says, can't dance. And then there's a kid in glasses in a wheelchair whose t-shirt says, 4 eyes. And an Asian student whose t-shirt says, brown eyes. Each student is modeling both embracing their own perfections, not as deficits, but as a beautiful part of their whole selves, and dancing next to and being in harmony with everybody else's perfectly imperfect selves. And finally, of course, Lea Michele walks out, dances out, wearing her t-shirt that says, nose, having decided ultimately not to get a nose job to fix her perfect Jewish nose. There is nothing so whole as a broken heart, says the Kotzker Rebbe. And Rabbi Shefa Gold writes on this Torah portion, when I look at nature, when I look at the human predicament of every person I meet, I can't find one thing that is unblemished. The closer I look, the more imperfections I find. Everyone and everything is in process. And so I want to bless all of us. I want to bless you today that you can experience yourself as whole, as perfectly imperfect, but perfect, to accept yourself the way that God accepts and loves you. I want to bless you that you can experience your face, your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, your voice, your chest, your belly, your butt, your thighs, your hands, your feet, all of the experiences that you have collected in this incredible body. I want to bless you that you can feel that they are a gift. not an accident, but an asset. And not something to hide, but something to share. And in doing so, find community and find wisdom and find deeper spirituality and satisfaction in being the person that God put you in this world to be, because we need you just the way you are.